There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. And these two men, the butler and the baker, it says that they weren't kept in prison for a short time. It says that they had been there for a while. And so Potiphar, he put Joseph in charge of serving them. And we know that the chief butler, that his position would have also been known as the king's cupbearer. And he would have been the one that was in charge and responsible for Pharaoh's wine. And we know a little bit about cupbearers from the book of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah, he was the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes. And we know that this chief butler would have been a very close and a very trusted advisor to the Pharaoh. And he probably didn't only deal just wine. He was an advisor, and he probably may have very well have been his friend. And he would have been around the Pharaoh every day, all day long. And he'd be tasting his wine to make sure it was adequate, and more importantly, that it wasn't poisoned. Because all kings have rivals, and their rivals are always trying to take their thrones. So this chief butler, he would have had to have been a wise man, and he would have had to have been a trustworthy man. And what the chief butler's position would have been in being in charge of the Pharaoh's wine, the chief baker, he would have had that same type of position preparing the Pharaoh's food. And so they both had positions of honor and trust, and they would have been very close to the Pharaoh. And it says that they offended the Pharaoh, which doesn't mean that they called him names or they said anything off color to him. But what it's believed to have happened is that there had been some type of an attempt on the Pharaoh's life. And it had to do something with either the food or the drink, or maybe both, but it was probably some type of poisoning. And Pharaoh, he wasn't going to take any chances, so he put them both in prison until things were sorted out. But in the bigger picture, from God's perspective, the real reason that these two were put into prison was to meet Joseph. And nothing is coincidence. And that's what ancient rabbis used to say. They said, there is no such thing as coincidence. So Joseph, he's been serving these two guys for a while, and he knows these men pretty well. And so one day he walks in, and he's probably bringing them their morning coffee with their pastries and their newspaper, the Egyptian Times or Egypt Today. And they're obviously saddened, and they're visually upset. And they usually weren't that way. This was much more than the normal prison blues. They were troubled by their dreams. And this gives us a little bit of insight into Joseph. And it shows us that he was a sensitive man, and he's concerned about the well-being of others as much as himself, and that he's also a very discerning man. What this tells us is that Joseph, he's not filled with bitterness and anger or self-pity from his own circumstances, which means that he hasn't only been focusing on just himself or only his own troubles. But if Joseph did that, he would have been perfectly justified. Nobody'd be able to blame him because we already have read of everything that he's already been through. But if he did, if he was self-absorbed and full of self-pity, he wouldn't be the man that he is. Because you see, Joseph, what he does is he receives every circumstance as if it had been prepared for him by God. And at the very least, he knows that God has seen it, and God has approved it, and God has allowed it, and he trusts God.
Now, it seems like nowadays, people, they're often directed, and it's by people who want to help them, but they always try to get them to go inward for their answers, to find solutions to their lives, as if peace can be found inside of themselves. In counselors, they'll advise their clients to examine their deep hurts and how they've been wronged, as if somehow self-pity would be able to help them and to give them some kind of insight. But if Joseph did that, it would have only made him bitter, because he was wronged by almost everybody. He would find no peace by looking inside of himself. And if that's what he did, all he would be able to find is the justification to be angry, which would have created hatred. And it would be hatred in his heart for those people that had wronged him. So then he would be no good to help anyone else, and he wouldn't even be good to even help himself. So the same set of circumstances that makes one person better, well, they can make another person bitter. It's all how you look at it. So Joseph, his focus isn't inward, but he's focused outward. He's more concerned about others, and he's serving God by serving the others put around him. And if you ever notice that people who do serve others, they always seem to have much more joy and peace, no matter what type of circumstances they have. And we see that with Jesus, he always served others, and he served them in all his circumstances through all his persecutions, all the way up to the cross. And he's still serving others today, because self-pity is a trap. Because what it does, it denies one's faith in God. It denies the belief that God loves you and that he knows where you are and that he sees you there. It makes you so you don't believe that he's willing to help you in your circumstances. So really, we all should be a lot more like Joseph in serving God by serving the others around us. And so Joseph, he asked these men, "Why so sad today?" And they said, "Well, each of us had a dream, but there's no interpreter." Well, in Egypt, they had professional dream interpreters, but there wasn't any in the prison. And so Joseph, he just asks them, and he says, "Well, don't interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." And so the chief butler goes first, because they have nothing better to do. So here they are. There's these three sitting around on their bunks, and the butler begins to tell this imprisoned slave Joseph his dream. And all the things in the butler's dreams are familiar things to the butler. There were grapevines, there were branches, and there was buds turning into blossoms, which turn into clusters of ripe grapes. And he squeezes them into wine, into a cup, and he gives it to the Pharaoh. And there's nothing in that dream that would ever give a clue to what that dream meant. So God had to tell the interpretation of that dream to Joseph, in Joseph's spirit, of what that dream meant. So this isn't like Daniel the prophet. Daniel the prophet, when he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream, Daniel had to go away, and he had to wait for a few days and then come back. This dream is being interpreted in real time. Joseph knows the interpretation immediately, and it wasn't going to be long until the dream's interpretation would be proven to be true or false, because Joseph is saying that the butler, he would be restored in 3 days. It was not some mystery date way out there in the future. And Joseph is confident about this interpretation. In fact, he's so confident that he immediately pleads with the butler, and he says, "Remember me when you're restored. Remember me to the Pharaoh." And then Joseph, he goes on and he tells him his own story, and he tells him, he says, "I'm not really a slave. I'm really a free man." And he doesn't mention anything about his brothers selling him, but he tells him that he was kidnapped and that he really shouldn't be here and that he really deserves better treatment than this. And this is the only time that we ever see Joseph asking a man to deliver him instead of just trusting God. But this wasn't going to happen for Joseph, because this wasn't Joseph's time. God already has a time set for Joseph. And if Joseph, if he was delivered here, he would never become a ruler in Egypt because Pharaoh didn't have his dreams yet. And Pharaoh would have no need for Joseph. And do you notice how Joseph's interpretation of the dream, it doesn't sound anything like a psychic's prediction. Everything he says is definite. He's not asking any questions to him and saying, do you know anybody rich? Or maybe somebody with a name that starts with a P, but it sounds like an F, and it rhymes with marrow or tarot, maybe Pharaoh, nothing like that. And he's not trying to give the butler a favorable interpretation because of his influential position, because he doesn't do that to the baker. The baker doesn't get a favorable interpretation. Joseph tells the baker straight up, he says, you're going to be killed, and you're not only going to be killed, you're going to be killed in a gruesome way. Because hanging in Egypt is a lot different than being hanged in America. The Egyptians, they didn't have the gallows. They didn't have a hangman's noose. What they did is they cut off your head, and then they stuck your body on a stake in the ground. And then Joseph tells them that he's going to be eaten by birds. And then he probably said, well, sorry, because he is a very sensitive, discerning man. Joseph didn't ask the baker for any recommendations to Pharaoh. He wasn't a people pleaser. And so 3 days later, it all comes true. And they both had their day in court at Pharaoh's birthday party. And this day that they call Pharaoh's birthday, it may not have actually been his birthday. It could have been the day that Pharaoh took the throne and became the Pharaoh. And when he became, because pharaohs were God to them, and he became a god. And it happened just like Joseph said. The chief butler was restored, and the chief baker, he was hanged. And so you can imagine back at the prison that there's Joseph, and he hears that butler has been restored, and he's sitting there, and he's hoping, and he's waiting, and all his bags are packed, waiting at the door for the butler to send somebody. But that day never came. He waited weeks and months, and it wasn't going to happen because this wasn't God's time. Joseph was never going to be rescued by the butler because he was never going to be rescued by a man. Joseph was going to be rescued by God himself, because we're not to put our trust in men. We're to put our trust in God alone. And God, he had much greater plans for Joseph. They're so much more greater than Joseph could have ever imagined. But for Joseph back here at prison, well, his hopes and his dreams, well, they died again. And as Christians, we find often when we're rescued from our troubles, it's when we have absolutely no hope left and we've run out of our own resources, where only God himself and God alone can save us. That's when God steps in.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.